Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. This is Pastor Joe here at St. Jacobus Lutheran Church in Woodside. Today is day 34 of our 40-day read up to the Ascension, this journey through the Gospel of Luke. Today we look at the second half of Luke chapter 22. We are now at the start of what we call the Passion. Jesus' Last Supper, trial, betrayal, multiple betrayals, death, resurrection, and ascension. This story that is familiar to many Christians, one that we hear every Holy Week. It's one that's been often portrayed in movies and in various ways. It's a story that I summarize with our preschool when we do Easter as some very bad things happen to Jesus and his friends don't think they're ever going to see him again, and they're very sad. That's the summary for 4-year-olds. I look at some of the recent conversations about it, and I think of a question I often get asked here in our community, and how we're invited to respond to that. So first I'm going to read Luke chapter 22, verses 39 to 71, and then talk a little bit about the things that we're hearing. Jesus came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into the time of trial." Then Jesus withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In Jesus' anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When Jesus got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." When Jesus was still speaking, suddenly a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, "Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man?" When those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, "Lord, should we strike with the sword?" Then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this." And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple police, and the elders who had came for him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." Then they seized Jesus and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. But Peter was following at a distance. When they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him in the firelight, stared at him and said, "This man was also with him." But Peter denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." A little later, someone else, on seeing Peter, said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then about an hour later, still another kept insisting, "Surely this man was also with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." At that moment, while Peter was still speaking, the cock crowed. Then the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the words of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. Now the men who were holding Jesus began to beat him and mock him. They also blindfolded him and kept attacking him. Prophecy. Who is it that struck you? They kept heaping many other insults on him. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought Jesus to their council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." Jesus replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." All of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" Jesus said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." The word of the Lord. Now, this begins several chapters of Jesus' abuse, beating, humiliation, challenges, and really scenes of torture and terror. Now, one of the more recent movies that have come out about this was Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, which was a cinematically beautiful movie. The language spoken was Aramaic, the spoken language of Hebrew, the spoken version of the Hebrew language, one that is more than likely what Jesus and his disciples and the people they met spoke. Now, the movie is incredibly focused on these scenes of torture, of blood and gore and this horrific imagery. And for some people, it was too much. It was distracting people from the purpose of Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection, for the salvation, for the forgiveness of sins, for the bringing of the kingdom of God to all people, for the restoration of this relationship. Now, one of the things here at church that's odd to some people is that we have right behind us, at the center of our altar, a crucifix. Now, we share our space with 3 or 4 other Baptist churches and people from different church traditions. And when people come, they always ask the same thing. Why do you have a crucifix? A crucifix is the cross with Jesus on it. And that's as opposed to just an empty cross, which most Protestant churches prefer. We worship, praise, and honor and give thanks for the risen Christ. And it's a little unusual for a Protestant Lutheran church to have a crucifix in it. And people always ask me, well, why is it here? My first answer is, well, it was here when I got here. It's also, I grew up in the Roman Catholic Church where they are familiar. In front of the church I went to as a child, there's a crucifix in the front that's probably 20, 30 feet high. And I'm used to it. But this comes to the heart of what we're experiencing when we hear this story. It serves as a forever image of what happens when good confronts evil. The extent that people will go through to get their way, to get what they want, to keep things the way they are, to maintain what they've built, or to protect what they have been entrusted with. It's the exposure of sin. It is a reminder to us that without Jesus' death, there is no resurrection. Without Good Friday, there is no Easter. Without Christ on the cross, there is no empty cross. There is none of those things. So part of it sits here as a reminder of that truth. And for me, I always think about what the cross means. I remember even as far back as high school. I've throughout most of my life, I've always worn some kind of cross. I don't know if it comes up on the video. And then I lose one, and I find another one, or I go through maybe one every 2 or 3 years. And I remember in high school, somebody would ask me, "Oh, well, why do you wear this this Roman instrument of torture?" And I thought to myself, oh, creative question, dude. We haven't heard that one before. But at the heart of it is a chance to say, well, this is what God has taken. This most horrific sign of pain, of suffering, of oppression, of the powers of the world crashing down on goodness, and turned it into the way of our salvation, and turned it into the defeat of sin and death and greed and all these different things. It stands as a sign of God taking something and changing it. The cross becomes our way to salvation, our only way to salvation. This opening of a path that we could not get through by our good works or by our kind acts or by our keeping the law or anything else. And we often, for me today at least, I worry more about what we do. I think of the idea that there are still nations, people, groups around the world performing acts of genocide. There's familiar ones, things like the Holocaust and some of these other events. There are genocides in Armenia and Rwanda. There are probably active groups, militias, armies, and stuff around the world trying to wipe out other people at this point. We have people around the world who still have slaves. There is a thriving sex slavery industry around the world. There are all these horrific things that people are continuing to do to each other. We can pretend that we've matured and become better and more rational and scientific or whatever, but at the heart of it, we remain people who hurt one another, who see their neighbor, somebody also loved by God, made in the image of God, created to be a servant of God, created to hear the good news, to let it shape them and their communities, to be invited into the joy of faith. And we want to take things from them, and we want to murder them or torture them or kill them or move them away from our land or whatever we want to do. There continues to be this sin, this hatred, this evil in the world. And the cross shows us, exposes, reveals that, the extent that people go through to shut Jesus up, to see, to experience, to know he is God with us. The religious authorities ask Jesus, "Are you the Messiah?" And he tells them, "Well, you're the one who says I am." And they do. They see the signs. They recognize what he's doing. They understand how he's fulfilling prophecy. But still they want him gone, because the Messiah is not doing what they want, what's going to benefit them, what's going to help them in their work. And they want to get rid of him. They want to eliminate him, no matter the cost, no matter the consequences. It is this that gets exposed. And it's this that we continue to do. It's this lesson that people, generation after generation and culture after culture, have not learned. And it sits at the heart of our faith, at the center of who we are as church. I know even on Palm Sunday, when we read through these 2 or 3 chapters of Luke or Matthew or John or Mark in the Gospels, there's parts where the congregation, the church, yell, "Crucify him." They call out the words that the crowd does in the gospel stories, because we we realize the humanness of what happens when we don't get our way. We don't get what we want. We get scared or concerned or greedy. And we remember that Christ sets us free from these things. And we're invited to live in that freedom, to honestly, authentically, and seriously live in that freedom, to wonder what would happen if Jesus appeared today in one of our communities or one of our cultures or societies. Would we want him gone so that we could keep doing what we were doing? Would we get scared by the changes Jesus was bringing and announcing? What it would mean or look like for us to really care for the poor and the outsider and to see our neighbor, no matter how different, as a loved child of God? Would we get frightened by what happened? Would we worry about what would be next? We're invited to take this journey through Jesus' passion with remembering that God is with us, that God is with us in suffering, that God is with us in the worst moments, that God is with Jesus as he prays, I don't want to do this. I don't want to endure this, but God's will be done. We see it in Jesus' own doing of these things because of love, because of care, because this is the way. We don't know why exactly this is necessary. It would be great if it wasn't. If at the center of our faith was a big explosion of joy and power that went out into the world and changed everybody's mind. But that's not what happens. We are reminded that God is present with us. God is present with Jesus in the garden, in the moment when his closest follower, Peter, denies even knowing him 3 times, when Jesus is put on trial and confronted and falsely accused of doing and saying different things. We remember that God is with Jesus on the cross, that God is with Jesus in the tomb, and that God is with us in all the things that we endure. Now that's a message that speaks powerfully to us today as we live in this pandemic, as we see all the stuff around us fail us, as we see all the things we were told, we got your back, no problem, we can fix anything, completely not fix things. We're invited to remember that our God is with us, that good comes from evil, that God uses all things for the benefit of people, that we are part of God's plan and God's care. Amen.